Media.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Svelte Radio. We are back after a hiatus. This is usually how it goes nowadays. We don't record as often as we would like. But we are back, as I said, and today I have a guest. It's Julian Burgess. Did I get it right?
That's it.
That's it? All right, cool. So Julian, you are a longtime Svelte veteran, or so I understand it to be, at least. Maybe tell us. Well, what's your story? What do you do? Maybe first off.
Yeah. So I kind of work at. I currently work at. I've been working at Bloomberg now for over 10 years, and I'm in their graphics team on the sort of engineering side. And so that's a mix of kind of like looking after extremely full stack, where it's kind of like looking after the servers, figuring out sometimes sort of DNS and CDN issues. And then also actually working on the graphics themselves and sort of the data pipelines and things like that. And so with that, I've been using Svelte for a long time. I think since version 2, which I think is sort of almost technically the beginning, because I think version 1 was sort of Rich kind of threw it in the bin almost as soon as it was ready and sort of like was like straight onto version 2. And it was funny actually because I almost worked with Rich as well. It's a bit of a sort of regret or sort of sad thing in my mind in that Rich was working at The Guardian and was...
Here in London?
Oh, yes. He was in the London office and was transferring to the New York office. And so we were chatting a bit about that. And then I got the job at Bloomberg. And so I left not long after, just before he arrived. But he came along to my housewarming, actually. I just moved flat at a similar time. And so that was the first time I met him. And yeah, he's a really...
So you go nice, way back then?
Yeah, so he's a really nice, warm, lovely person. And I suppose from that, I then started looking at some of his projects. And I was saying earlier, I think I used Gobble, and I should have looked up what it was. I can't remember what it even did. And
we'll have to ask Rich.
Yeah. And there was Splunk, which
That's an odd name.
Yeah, it's, this spelunking is where you kind of go down into a cave.
Yeah.
And so we actually still use that at work, where it's a kind of the way we have a modified version of it, but it kind of it's just sort of goes into a folder and just any files, so sort of text or sort of CSV or JSON or anything it sort of finds, it will kind of append it onto a tree so that you can then sort of use that quite easily within your code, because we're using that within a build step, so it doesn't really matter, or it may not matter about the file size in memory at the time where you're doing the build. The output of the build still matters, but it's kind of one of those things where it's nice to just you don't have to worry about loading files, it's just done for you. And I think I played around a tiny bit with Reactive, but never used it. And then...
So Reactive is like the predecessor of Svelte.
Yeah.
One could say, I think.
And then so I think Rich made the announcement about Svelte, and I was like, this sounds good.
And this is Svelte 2 we're talking about.
Yeah, that's it. And so I tried it out. And I think I'm going to have to double check. It was either the UK election for 2015 or 2017. I can't remember which year it was, because we've had quite a few elections in the UK. And yeah, the thing which was, the thing that I think particularly was good was the way that it was, which isn't necessarily, or now with the way SvelteKit works, is sort of different entry points into this, but the way you could have multiple entry points, because we wanted to make it where there was the main graphic itself, which shows the sort of overall results, but then we wanted to extract out bits of it to use on a widget for the homepage. Yeah. And so the homepage gets a lot more traffic than anything else. And so trying to make it very small is of key importance. And I can't remember how, it was really impressively small, like, 14K or something like that of the total code that we had. Mm-hmm. And I think we managed to get the data down to like under 1K or something like that as well.
Yeah, that's almost nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was kind of, you're not sort of worrying about the sort of performance hit or things like that. And it's just kind of grown, really. So now the whole team, the team has expanded a lot. We're close to about 50 people, I think, across sort of London and New York and in Asia as well. And yeah, and I think that it's interesting as well, because, obviously React is so big. And I looked at React. I've never really worked with it. Because we actually, before it as well, we used, one of our colleagues used Angular. And so I could sort of see how good it was in terms of like the being able to make components, but it also seemed like it would quite quickly get into kind of crazy problems with like how much rendering was going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not very nice when you're doing like some interactive graph or.
And it can be, yes, because it's particularly with graphics, you're often doing a lot of stuff with SVG, but you can have quite sort of big DOM trees where there's sort of like hundreds or thousands of sort of elements going on. And so, yeah, trying to avoid sort of unnecessary renderers is important, and particularly as well where you have sort of interaction. So if it's sort of like some sort of mouse, you don't want sort of a mouse over to sort of like cause the whole tree to be re-rendered. You just want sort of, it's like the subtree or whichever bit to do that.
I'm guessing that makes you excited about Svelte 5?
It does, but I think there's a lot of kind of uncertainty and skepticism, because I think with that as well, the thing which again was also a big attraction to me was that Svelte looks a lot like HTML, regular HTML with a script tag and CSS.
I assume in Svelte 2 it was even like HTML files, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I think you could put kind of any extension. So I think we did use .html, I think, which was a bit confusing perhaps. But then, and you had to, it wasn't, I think with Svelte 2, we didn't have the dollar prefix as well. I think you had to have a computed property that you exported. And that then each function was the kind of like, well, this was the thing that depends on something else. And that,
I mean, the documentation is actually still up.
It's still up.
If you go to v2.svelte.dev, you get to the old V2 documentation. I've just randomly, occasionally, just gone in there and just
to check.
Just to check, see how.
Because it feels weird. I think because I remember, in a way, I was like, this dollar thing seems a bit crazy as well when it first came out. And I was like, oh no, this is broadly good. I mean, I think it can be. Well, I did that talk at Svelte Summit as well, where I was sort of saying how that it's one of the things I see a bit with people. Because we have a sort of a variety of sort of levels of skill and it's sort of on the team, but it's one of the things I see sometimes where people just kind of dollar prefix almost everything.
Yes, I've seen that as well.
Yeah, and not necessarily, which isn't. I'm not saying it's actually necessarily bad, but you're kind of like, if you're kind of thinking, is it possible for this value to sort of change without it causing all of the things below it to change as well, or is it, and it's like, can that value sort of is it possible really for it to be cached and reused, and even if it is it sort of valuable as well? Because it's kind of like if it's doing some kind of long thing and then it comes out with a string, that's great. Maybe you want to hold on to that, but it's usually not like that. And so I feel like trying to put the logic into a whole kind of block, which sort of encapsulates everything that's supposed to be going on at that point. So particularly around things like sizing and stuff like that, where you're kind of, so in a graphic, very often you'll be kind of, we use D3 a lot as well, sort of a JavaScript visualization library. And so a very common pattern is you've got some data, you loop over them to find the sort of the maximum sort of and minimum value to set the domain of the scale. And then you're kind of doing some other things with the scale based on the size of the window and all of that kind of thing. So all of that is a kind of usually a nice sort of concise block that should go in a reactive block. Yeah.
I find that like when I've seen people use reactive blocks, I try to avoid them actually, but then my use case is not a lot of interactive stuff, right? I just use SvelteKit and then I use form actions and the load function, and that's pretty much it.
Right.
Some tiny amounts of interactive stuff I do, but like rarely stuff where things are like moving around the screen or I have to like recalculate things and stuff. Like I usually just let SvelteKit handle like the invalidation of the data and like updating it and stuff. So, but I've seen like examples of people overusing reactive statements. And I find it gets very hairy very quickly if you have like many blocks and many statements. Yeah. Because you kind of don't understand like how they trigger each other. And also a reactive statement, if you put it in the script tag, it even if you put it above some other declaration, it always gets instantiated last, I think, if I remember correctly. So you have to also think about the order in the script tag that you put things. That's usually not a problem, but it's something I've
No, I think that is, actually, I guess it's true, that people, it is also confusing as to, with a reactive block on mount and then just sort of stuff that is directly in the script tag, which exactly is going to happen first. And I'm not even certain I could say for sure without, if my life depended on it. But I think with that as well, what we tend to do, is that sort of common pattern, particularly where things are arrays. You just have an empty array, and you're like, let me just, so it sort of is initially instantiated with that.
Yeah.
And then, data is loaded, and then you've sort of set it, and then it sort of triggers it again, but it's only one render.
Yeah.
And that seems to be sort of a pragmatic solution. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking about the Svelte 5, and you were talking a bit about simplicity of Svelte before.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say another thing as well is we were
that.
also early to using Sapper as well.
Right.
So we used that to make a number. I think we did at least 1 or 2 elections, and we also did the B Schools business schools best business schools guide.
Yeah. So Sapper, for those that don't know about it, the people that are new to Svelte.
Yeah.
Sapper is the predecessor to SvelteKit.
Yeah. And it was good. It was a lot better, I think, than anything we could have done previously, or would have been. It made things much simpler, but relatively, Kit made things so much easier. There were a lot of problems around sort of page navigation and sort of exactly where events would occur, and sort of trying to squeeze in. It's sort of like, even when you got the page itself roughly doing what you wanted, there was complexities with things like tracking and analytics and things like that, where it sort of has to sort of know which, whether it happens at the beginning of the page or the end, and whether it still has the previous page's URL in it and that kind of thing. So anyway, almost I think all of those problems in Kit just disappeared and was so much nicer as well. It's just like, Kit has been a huge improvement. So I'm excited about Svelte 5. In fact, it was interesting because I did a short lightning talk in London at the Svelte meetup quite some time ago now, maybe 2 years ago.
SvelteKit's been out for a long time.
Yeah. Well, and this was around. I guess that wasn't the title of the talk, but it was essentially around kind of fine-grained reactivity, which is now the hot buzzword with Svelte 5, because there's the immutable tag in Svelte 4 and probably 3 as well, I think, where you can sort of say, if these objects are not mutated, then it will just do simple kind of like checks, which can eliminate sort of renders that don't need to happen, because at the moment Svelte by default is pessimistic, so it sort of assumes that you might have mutated the object. And so there's a kind of little demo bit of that buried, well, not exactly buried, but it's towards the sort of advanced sort of endy bits of the documentation and tutorials. But it had always sort of stuck in my mind of kind of like, well, that'd be interesting if we could try and sort of eliminate unnecessary renderers. Although I have to say as well, with that, we'll probably talk about this more in a bit, but I use Svelte quite a lot in my side projects, and it's amazing actually how fast things are. And that I think, it can also be that, am I, over-optimizing and worrying about eliminating renders, and it's actually fine. You can still just do thousands and thousands of things and still get 60 frames per second, and it's no problem. So I don't know, but it feels, I think that there's also to some extent, if things are definitely only rendering when they change, it's also interesting because you can then sometimes have sort of effects which sort of play on change. Yep. And that itself can be a kind of a useful kind of visual sort of UX kind of addition. So I'm excited to see where that goes in Svelte 5. But it does mean that, so basically, because I said to Rich about the talk, and he was like, oh, don't bother about it, because in Svelte 5 it completely eliminates it. And I was like, okay. But so I've only played around with Svelte 5 a bit in my spare time, because we're currently working on the US election for 2024. Right. And it's this year is definitely not a time to go playing around with completely new technologies. It's a much bigger team, and it's more ambitious as a graphic. I mean, it's been release candidate for how long now? Quite a long time. Yeah, a very long time. I think as well, it's just conceptually, and because it has been sort of so a few people have talked about it, where the dollar had this kind of nice sort of simplicity to it. Yeah, and I think kind of state derived seems okay. It is, I think, because I feel already I've read a lot and watched quite a lot of videos where people are like, be careful with effect. Yeah, and it's like you kind of, and I can see why it's problematic, but I know at the same time I'm definitely gonna stumble into those problems myself. Right. Yeah. Same. Yeah. I was actually interested as well. There was a video. I've forgotten the name of the guy. It's the guy who says "easy peasy lemon squeezy." Ah, Mattia. Yeah, Mattia. Joy of Code. Yeah. I think. And that was a really helpful video. But he was talking, I think it was about this animation sort of library he had, and how he was converting that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And the fact that he was still actually using stores as with Svelte 5, and I didn't actually realize that they were so compatible like that. And I was like,
yeah,
that
they're going to
stay. Yeah. Right, that's good, because I do love my readable stores. They're one of the sort of favorite things.
Yeah, because one of the new features of Svelte 5 is the fact that you can extract those reactive statements, or if, as it were, to separate files, right? So you can reuse the logic. You couldn't do that before because reactive statements could only be read by the compiler in the Svelte files, right? So that's an interesting change, right? You could kind of move away from stores into something like that, but then I know some people are worried about interactivity outside of Svelte, because if you use the rune style, so you have to basically create a file that's named something.svelte.javascript or .ts, right? And that's where you put your logic, and then you can use runes in there, and everything is fine, and etc. But nothing outside of Svelte understands those things, right? I think so. In that sense, stores are still maybe an easier way to interact with non-Svelte stuff. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't gone down that route.
Well, I have found that sometimes with projects where, because I think once you start to sort of think reactively like that, you kind of often want that with things. And so there was like this project, I should maybe say, by prefixing it, that in 2019, I did a master's degree at Goldsmiths in computational arts, which was really fun and exciting. And I did learn a bunch of things, but it's still with that. It's like when you've got a tool that it becomes your kind of like favorite tool. And so I use Svelte for quite a lot of the projects with that. And I use Svelte in sort of artistic kind of creative ways. And so, there was something like that where I was controlling a whole load of servos, and it was basically just have an array of like the positions you want to go to. And I was like, well, actually it's because you would sort of send this over the wire. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, you don't necessarily have that much time to investigate as to how these things work. But, it's a very low bandwidth. It's like 9,600 bits per second.
Okay, wow.
And so you're kind of like, well, I don't want to go send in unnecessary kind of move to this position if it's still the existing position. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I was like, well, I'll just ship it through Svelte. I mean, I could as well. I was like, I could just write my own kind of like array diffing kind of thing. Or, maybe there's probably tools for that. But I was like, well, I don't really have to think about it like this. I'll be like, why not just, it's available on a web page. But it is a bit strange sometimes where you kind of have things. Well, I don't know. I kind of go back and forth because it's having something that's completely kind of, there's sort of like headless, but then there's also kind of like not even having any sort of interface to it at all. So this is strange in that it's kind of like actually the UX. The user interface is doing the calculation, so it's like nothing happens unless this web page exists somewhere. Yeah, and so a browser has to be kind of like looking at it, so to speak. But you're kind of like, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing because it's kind of like just like a kind of interface panel that sort of tells me what is the position of these servos. Yeah, and so but it is a bit strange because you kind of if you have to have something that can run a browser somewhere. I suppose in a more purist way, it would make sense if that wasn't happening. Right. If it could just be happening purely server side.
Yeah. All right. So you still like your stores? You want to keep them? Yeah. All right. So how do you use stores like at Bloomberg? Like generally, do you use it to like interact with something like 3JS or is that done without stores? Or
we don't use 3JS tons, or at least I haven't particularly. Right. I mean, it's every. I mean, essentially, so I should sort of say in terms of like in the graphics team, pretty much the way because I sort of look after the back end of how we publish graphics. Right. And essentially, the API of the graphic or the publishing system is just that we have a public folder, and we just deploy that. Right. And so there's an awful lot of intelligence that has to go into the sort of build step to make the graphic. And then otherwise, after that, it's all on the front end. And so, wait, what was I talking about?
Stores.
Oh, stores, I said, yes. Yeah. So, again, 3JS. So it's kind of, so with that, it's very open for people to try things out. So we don't, if people want to, so if you're doing something with 3JS, it might be that Svelte is not necessarily useful as a sort of tool for handling this, or you might use Svelte, which is still built on Svelte, but it's kind of often to its own thing a bit. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. The classic things, stores are great for kind of interaction where you're kind of, you're selecting some kind of data point. And it's often, even if you're not, I quite often would sort of advise people to be like, it's a good way to use a store, even if, because there's a lot of editing that goes into a graphic as well. So you quite often will be like, it starts off as one chart and then we split it out into 3 charts and then it goes to 2 and then it goes back to 1 again or something like that. And so it's kind of having that sort of flexibility is quite important, because what you don't want is where you're sort of, the editor says, oh, actually, I don't think we need this. And you're like, oh, damn, why did I put all this work into it? Or, if you take that chart out, then it breaks the interactivity of other things or something like that. Yeah. And so, having that kind of thing where you're just sort of binding to a store, which is like, I'm selecting this sort of value on the X variables or something like that. And then you can just be like, across all of the graphics, you then just take that value and be like, now this is the selected one. So is very useful.
Do you know if it's common to write like custom stores, or is that something
not that common?
Just generally use like the built-in writable and readable, and
it tends to be.
Because I kind of find the custom stores to be a way of like encapsulating some form of functionality. Yeah, that I like. It could be anything, but
it seems a good idea. I mean, I think it's building something that is sort of so strong, like that does strongly encapsulate, is sometimes tricky, or to like what extent, because I think very often as well, it's quite a small number of people that are actually working on a graphic, and so a lot of that knowledge is in your head about the sort of the structure.
I assume as well, like if you're in the graphics department, you don't have unlimited time getting things out. You have to kind of like
there's very much
you have some deadlines, and then once it's done, you don't really touch it again. Maybe you go back and look at how you did something.
Sometimes things do. It varies. Sometimes things do get updated. We've got we've made a push this year, which is working quite well with to extract out reusable components. Mm-hmm. But with that as well, we've the sort of direction we've taken is, rather than trying to build the perfect component where you just to kind of like just use it and it does everything, it's actually to try and build a kind of a good sort of component, but that we actually say we set it up so that you actually just copy it into your project. Because sometimes you can do a component that is just like it does everything that it needs, but with things like a table is so fiendishly complex. There's no perfect table component. Nope. And it's like, and the more you try, all that happens is you just get a bigger and more complex table component.
Just gets more abstracted and like complicated.
Yeah, because there's always something you can do to a table that will just make it incompatible with other things you've done. Yep. And so with that, it's more like, here's a bunch of kind of like, this is, a way of doing a table like this, and this is a way of doing it like that. And, and particularly once you want to start putting other components inside the table, and then you kind of like, based on this thing shows or doesn't, and all of that.
Right.
So that I
hadn't even thought about that as a use case for like showing things on it,
and also just because it's you find this all the time in HTML, just because it's sort of table shaped doesn't mean that actually a table is the right sort of underlying elements to use as well.
Although the table element is kind of underused in HTML, I would say.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe, yeah. I mean, it's weird because I'm so old school that there was, for years, there was all that thing of like, stop using tables for layout.
Right.
And
well, maybe that's why I feel like tables are underused, because people are like, oh, I've been taught I should never use tables.
Oh, that's true. I think there was that.
So they just like, ooh.
Yeah. Yeah, people were like,
they're quite nice.
Yeah, no, I do like tables. I mean, I think it's all it's to do with the way the layout. I mean, I don't know what the algorithm is inside, but you realise it's really weird and complex to be this sort of like, get the biggest thing that won't compress, and then so there's all these kind of complex cascading kind of effects on like the sizing for it. Whereas, but I mean, it's also one of those things where if you're making big tables, hundreds of rows, then it does get kind of weird and complex. But I mean, if you're using it very often in the way we tend to use tables, you just like, this column's always this width and things like that. So that the render and sort of layout performance is perfectly fine anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was going to say the other thing we use readables for, particularly for the election, is for sort of polling and for fetching data as well. And that's also one of those things I'd like a lot. that they're sort of lazily evaluated. And it's funny how often I forget that as well. It's like so many times when I'm doing it, I'm like, why isn't this thing even working? And I'm like, oh, because I'm not subscribed to it.
Right. Yeah.
So I often build quite a lot of little sort of test pages for myself as well, which is now again so much easier with SvelteKit, where you can just be like, just check that this sort of thing, this component is doing its thing, and it will be sort of subscribing to that store in the way I expect. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the $ prefix thing for stores kind of it kind of tricks you in a way that you're not using a store.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to.
It can also
reason
be
about sometimes, but
strange with when you have multiple sort of deriveds that you don't know which order they're going to occur in, and I presume, I don't know if there is even if it's just a sort of a luck kind of race condition thing, or whether it's just a sort of like how at runtime, or whether it's how the code is compiled. I haven't looked into this, but basically it's not reliable, so you need to think through.
Yeah.
You can't have. I mean, I suppose that's effectively you're having a kind of weird sort of side effect in some sort of way happening there. So, but anyway, so I've learned that the hard way, that you're kind of you need to sort of think through this thing. But often it just means inserting another sort of derived store. But it can get a bit of a mad thing. In fact,
it's kind of similar to the reactive statements, right? That it's like you don't know which one's triggering in what order.
Yeah,
but it's a bit clearer probably. But
I forgot his name again. You mentioned earlier the video guy.
Mattia,
yeah. I think he also had that thing where he was demonstrating where he built a nice sort of diagram tree that was showing some of the interactivity. I would love if we could do that with Svelte generally, if it could have a kind of, show the entire tree of interactivity.
I've always felt like the kind of developer tools are a bit lacking in Svelte.
Oh, really?
In the sense that extensions for for the browser. Like I know there is one. There used to be one, but I don't think it's updated anymore.
Right.
Having something like that in there would be nice to see so this is happening.
Yeah.
This thing is updating this thing, or maybe if you could see something updated here, and then you could go back and through the history and see in which order it was triggered and why it was triggered and stuff like that.
That's true, but there's what was that amazing tool that was demoed at Svelte Summit, where there was a
the Svelte Inspector.
Yeah, that's it.
That one's really good though. But that's another kind of thing. I always forget how to enable it.
Yeah,
I never enable it. It's very frustrating because I know there's documentation somewhere you just put this in the config, but then I always wonder which config. There's the Svelte config and then there's the Vite config, and I never remember where. I wish it was already enabled by default.
Yeah, and I'm going to do that next week then, is enable it and remember, because ages and ages ago I remember I had actually a chat with Rich. I mean, it's amazing as well how many things you can kind of say, can you make this happen, and it somehow does. Because I was saying that there aren't sort of source maps for HTML, so it's weird that you can kind of in the inspector you can say, where does this bit of CSS come from, and it tells you where does this bit of JavaScript come from. But when the HTML is there, you're like, where did this come from? It's sorry, no idea.
Yeah.
But that tool effectively kind of does that.
Yeah, because you can click something and then you just end up. Well, you don't click in the source, right? You just click the element on the page, right? But it's actually it's very cool feature.
Yeah.
I
bet it could do it from the source as well. Actually, I mean, if it could do it from
maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm sure it could do it from the DOM too.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? If you just do it somehow. But yeah, for those that don't know what we're talking about, we're talking about something called the Svelte Inspector, which is basically a tool that lets you click. So you basically enable the tool by adding some config, and then you hold down a key, and then you click anywhere on the page, and then that opens up your editor and at the correct line and the correct file and everything. So saves a bunch of time. I remember me and Dominic, the guy that made the inspector, we were talking about how you could. What if you added an editor inside of the browser? So you could just click it, and then it would pop up like a panel, and you could just edit something and then save it, and then it would just update. You wouldn't even have to switch context to the editor. You would just like, I don't know how it would work, and it would obviously be like a very limited version of a real editor.
Well, that could be very handy though. Yeah.
But if you just wanted to change like a value in the fade transition to make it look faster or slow, I don't know, whatever, right? I think that could be nice. Or what if you could shift click the element, and then you would get a list of attributes that you could change on the component. Like you could do so many things with something like this.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah,
it's one of those weird things because I find I'm definitely guilty of this, where I get so stuck in my ways with the kind of, the sort of editor and the sort of general setup I have.
Yeah, same.
And I can sort of see things. So I'm like, oh, this looks better, but I'm like, I don't have time to retrain my brain right now.
Yeah.
Actually, I find often December is quite a good month. It tends to be a sort of relatively quiet month. It's
like a lull in especially the news cycle.
Yeah,
maybe?
News cycles. It tends to die off because everyone sort of stops creating events and news. Usually, hopefully, like that's sort of like natural disasters and things like that. Hopefully, don't happen. So that can be a good time to kind of reevaluate, your own sort of tools and processes.
Yep. Yeah, I've been trying to use a new editor lately. It's called Zed.
Okay.
Which is like a native, an actual native application. So it's not like a web view or something like VS Code. And I feel like it's nice to, like, when you click a file, it actually just like pops up and with the correct stuff instantly instead of having to like wait for a bit. I mean, it doesn't take that long usually in VS Code. It's usually very fast, at least on my computer, but it's still like you can still notice like sometimes the syntax highlighting, it lags a bit and then it shows up. And
I think there was an interesting thread a while ago on Hacker News about this, and it's very hard to it'd be interesting to kind of, you can't go back into the past, and you like how much of this is just kind of what's the word for it, like nostalgia or things like that. But they were sort of saying about old kind of text-based interfaces and how fast they were.
Yeah.
And, you were kind of like, when you were back in sort of DOS and things like that, and you would just be like, and they were like, oh, everything just happened at like 200 milliseconds or less, and it just felt instant. I'm like, I don't know if it did, though, because I know at some point there was this thing where, I can't remember what it was, but at some point I like turned on, like, this was many, many years ago, but even still I was like switched on like this old 486 or something like that it had. And I could not believe how slow and noisy it was. I mean, it sounded like a little sort of machine gun was going on inside it with the sort of the noise of the hard drive.
Like the hard drive,
yeah. And so I don't know, but I feel like...
rose tinted glasses, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I also as well, I definitely remember that that sort of back sort of early days at school, that you could overtake the speed of the computer, but you kind of knew what the commands were. In fact, where you would sort of like, you would sort of like type it in, it would just be filling up the sort of keyboard buffer,
right.
And then it would kind of like, all your commands would sort of suddenly execute after that. So I don't know, but it probably was that it wasn't. I mean, I think we kind of, it goes back and forth, it's kind of like processors have got sort of, much faster, but we sort of are continually sort of slowing down the interface. And I don't know, it's a tricky thing. I mean, actually, I know that Chrome has recently changed their sort of performance tab. And
really?
I tried it out the other day.
I use Safari all day, every day, even for development, which is kind of unusual, I think.
I was forced to use it for a while at work because for some problem with Chrome that I couldn't understand. In the end, I just re-imaged my Mac because I was like, I just have to be back on Chrome.
Yeah.
It's weird though, actually, because in my personal life, I use Firefox, so I'm kind of like between both of them. But sort of it's. I mean, actually, that's one of the things that I sort of not exactly miss, but it's kind of with graphics, because like you were sort of saying, the way that because it's news, so you work on them, and so it's one of the joys is that because we're continually creating new graphics, it's a great opportunity to try out new things, because you're like, let me try it, see if it works, and if it doesn't, well, you kind of either throw it away and kind of make it work some other way, but quite often you'll be like, this was fine, but I didn't really enjoy it, or it wasn't that amazing, so I won't use it again. But with that as well, it means that there's not in the way that if you're just sort of working on the same app for years and years and years, you can spend a lot of time kind of thinking about sort of performance and probably looking in Chrome. Although I say that, I say you could, it doesn't feel like people are doing that
Right.
much. You know, there's so many really terrible websites out there that are
Yeah, like
really slow.
unbelievably slow
Yeah.
sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Even just simple websites sometimes are really, really,
Yeah.
really, really slow. Sometimes it boggles my mind a bit, like especially when businesses have very slow websites.
Yeah.
It's
I found as well, actually, it's interesting because I work quite a lot with the data structures that we use. And so particularly for elections, I'm trying to, because it's something where we're going to be fetching that data an awful lot of times, and there's going to be a lot of people doing it.
right.
And so I find that it's hard to beat CSVs or TSV.
Yeah.
Because it's just, you're just kind of, normalize it down to the sort of smallest thing. And
Right,
then,
right. It's just like number, comma, number, comma, number.
That's it.
Style, right?
I mean, I've gone, because I like to optimize, so I've done a bit of extra sort of tweaking where I kind of like tweak how dates work. And, if it's true or false, just remove the falses and you only put one as a true value. But all of that, it does add up, this bike shaving.
And election data is probably quite a lot of data.
It's not
Not that much.
It's not loads. I mean, for the US, I think there's, off the top of my head, maybe 3,500 counties or something like that. So that's at that very fine level. Otherwise, if you're just doing it for the states, so we probably wouldn't. I don't think we're doing that for the as a sort of a default view. That's more like a detailed view. But I mean, we also do it where we sort of break it down by state as well and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you can spend a lot of time being like trying to get a sort of file down from like 60K to 50K.
Yeah.
And then you look at these sites and they've got like a 12 megabyte video or something like that. And you're like, why am I even doing this? And also it's hard. But the thing I suppose is to remember that code and data kind of have very different sort of performance effects. From like a video is just going to be, fetched somewhere in the background.
12 megabytes of JavaScript though.
Yeah.
That's going to slow you down.
Yeah. So, no, it is kind of strange like that, but yeah, it feels like it would be quite fun in a way to work on a really big app that was just a sort of ongoing venture. I mean, we do have that bit. Actually, our internal tools use Svelte as well.
Is that something you work on as well?
Some of them, yeah. So our publishing, the internal publishing system that we use just for graphics uses it as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where there's a whole load of urgent things, and so it's always that kind of like, which is the most urgent, and so that hasn't been.
That's the same. I think that's the same in pretty much all business stuff.
Yeah,
like it's always like a trade-off of how well can we do it and how fast can we do it, and you have like business usually leans towards do it fast.
Yeah,
which in the long run can probably slow you down a bit, but.
I think also with internal tools, you're kind of like at what point, the goal is never the internal tool, so the tool is to sort of enable something else to happen.
But I find it's nice to have the view that there are you have users for your internal tools, right? So they have to work even if they, obviously, like, maybe I'm contradicting myself now, but like, they don't have to look as good as the stuff that you put out in the public, right? Because it's just a tool that someone is using. But then there's a nice feeling of using a tool that like kind of sparks some joy. Yeah. So it kind of, I don't remember who it was, but I think what Josh Nussbaum, he did a talk at Svelte Summit. He said on Twitter, what was it? Something, I think I mentioned it before, but like, how code affects your, like the quality of the code base affects work-life balance.
Right.
Because if the code is bad, you go home and you're tired because you've been thinking extra hard about how to do something that should have been easy. So I don't know where I was going with this. I was going to make some point, but yeah. Let's move on. It's just like a quote that I like because it's a thing that I never thought about it in that way, but it's very true. Like if you're working in a so this was the point. Like if you're working in a tool that is hard to use, then you're going to be frustrated, and you're not going to be happy working, right? So even if it is an internal tool, it is important.
Yeah. Now, I think with it, it's like, at the same time, actually, it's funny because design-wise, because we know it's internal, it's more like a thing to have fun, actually.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of designy, creative people on the team as well. So often it can be kind of like, let's just, ask them to do, submit something sort of, fun icons or things like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think, it's a mix, but it's kind of like, as you say, there's always the sort of trade-offs as to where you sort of are spending the time and energy.
Yeah. Oh, should we make it look cool, or should we add this feature where I can that simplifies life for everyone?
Yeah.
Probably the latter, right? Do you want to talk about side projects?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I sort of mentioned already about that. I did that degree at Goldsmiths, and so my sort of it was weird because it started in 2019, and so I was graduating during COVID, and it was a strange time because we weren't sure if we were going to have a final show at all.
And it's very visual, I suppose.
Yeah, so typically you have a sort of a big sort of end of sort of degree show, and there's round about, I think back then there was about 80 people doing the course, and I think it's now grown to over 100. So it's quite a big show, and you're given a sort of a bit of wall space or sort of floor space, and people build all kinds of amazing sort of interesting sort of artistic kind of coding things. And so, so it was unclear as to what exactly was going to go on. And I was like, well, and also with that, we didn't have as much ability to go into the university and use the sort of lab they have with there. It has a lot of sort of tools like the sort of laser cutters and printers and things like that. So, and it was interesting. Early in lockdown, everyone was saying how they had these sort of strange dreams. And I was sort of thinking about that. And I have sort of quite strange and interesting dreams as well.
Okay.
And so we were kind of like in this little crit group, and we were sort of talking through ideas. And so there's the sort of idea I pursued, where I was sort of looking at how sort of the kind of ideas and sort of connectedness within dreams. And like, are we, because you often wonder, like, or I wonder, is like, are we having the same dreams? Are we, or like, because there's always that sort of idea about where does sort of like consciousness kind of come from, and where are we like that? Because it's sort of like, I don't know, this all gets into all sorts of weird philosophical bits about, like the simulation hypothesis or things like this. Right. But, we're having all these sort of like thoughts and dreams, and we're like, where are they coming from, and why what are the sort of relationships? So
even just like, what's the point of a dream?
Yeah, it's all kind of strange like this. And what was quite fun with this is you can take quite a lot of the sort of skills that you have from journalism and applying them in an artistic context is really quite fun, because you don't have to have the same integrity. It's like in journalism, you're always like, where does this data come from? Is it a sort of a reasonable source and all of this? And in the art world, you're kind of given much more sort of liberal sort of license to sort of, play around with things. So I scraped a whole bunch of dream diary entries. There's a couple of sort of sites which sort of have these. And it came to about 100,000 dreams, I think, in total.
Oh, wow.
And I used Word2Vec, which was that sort of, it was issued by, I've forgotten the name of the people, but they worked at Google. And it was one of the early kind of sort of language models. And it's still, honestly, it's cool. It's witchcraft a bit to me, how this even really works. In that you can basically just feed in lots of text, and it just sort of somehow there's sort of multiple levels of magic, but somehow a sort of tokenizer is able to work out what makes good tokens. So you're not explicitly saying just split on space. Yeah. It is able to sort of do more cleverer stuff than this. And then from that, it will work out kind of relationships between words. And then you just get back these vectors of the words, of the terms. And it absolutely does work, where you'll see this in these sort of explanations of how does sort of word vectorization work, where you can sort of, you sort of, they would say like take like the word queen and add male, and you'll be the nearest node in the high dimensional space will be king.
Oh, right.
Well, and they were sort of saying you could do things like take the word Iraq, subtract violence, and you get Jordan.
Oh, right.
Something like that. And so so it was really interesting with that. So I basically, and it's nice because it was 100,000 sort of entries sounds like a lot of text as a sort of human, but to these machine models, it's nothing really.
Yeah, like these days as well, like how much data are OpenAI or Meta training their
Yeah, it's just
large
crazy.
language models on. Yeah.
And so I think I got it to output, I think, at 100 or 128 dimensions or something like that for all of the terms. So you get sort of a weight for each term. And then I'm trying to remember what I did.
So you took the diary texts and
Yes,
then fed them into and then you got tokens out.
Yeah, and so I think I was using 100 dimensions at the kind of where it's working out the relationships between them. And then there's an amazing algorithm called Tisne, T-S-N-E.
What?
Tisne.
Tisne?
Yeah, so it's T lowercase dash S-N-E. I can't remember what it stands for now. And it's a way of reducing dimensionality.
Okay.
So you can take these 100 dimensions and say reduce this to 3 dimensions, and so it's sort of like it's like you're taking a sort of cosine difference between all of the values across these high dimensions and sort of reducing it down.
Sounds very complicated.
It does, yeah. I mean, it's again very very mathsy and clever, and it's Google have a interactive form which is really quite satisfying to watch because you have sort of all these things in just a completely sort of jumbled space, and then it sort of squeezes them, and it looks a little bit like have you seen when starlings or birds do those flocks where there's a word for this, what's it called, the word has escaped me, but anyway there's a special word where they sort of all fly around in formations.
I know what you
things.
mean. Yeah.
And so it looks a little bit like that, and then it kind of like it sort of flattens it out, and it's like, and then it's resolved, and then the sort of the amount of change is disappearing. So used that to basically put them into this 3-dimensional space, and then used a lot of the D3 tools for sort of geographic projection. Yeah. So I then sort of projected it to this stereographic projection, which is sort of how you would look at the nighttime stars. So it's a projection where basically you assume you're in the center point of the Earth, and you're kind of looking out for a sort of sphere which is effectively infinitely far away.
So I'm looking at it right now. It looks very cool. I thought it, like when I first came into the room, I thought it was like just an image of the like star signs and stuff.
Yes.
Like when I initially looked at it.
But that's good. That's the intention, really.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's great success. I'll try to take a photo and put it in the description.
There's a blog post as well on it.
Oh, nice.
And so I used Svelte for that because again, it was just. I mean, I think so. It's being able to make components just is such a huge sort of game changer because it's just so relative to how. Because I mean, it's like I've been writing HTML and sort of JavaScript long enough that that Backbone was a big sort of breakthrough,
right?
Because it was kind of like that was sort of more like a sort of structure as to how kind of things could depend on other things.
How you could reuse things.
Yeah, but I mean, and then we were still using D3, which I mean D3 is excellent, but I feel like the select kind of update pattern is conceptually quite complex. It's very powerful, and it's particularly powerful when you have very sort of particular or complex kind of animations, because you can sort of just select the piece you need and kind of transform it in a way. It's both, but it is with that, it's difficult to understand. I think also it's sort of, and that again is sort of partly again with going back to the sort of the very early days of Svelte. We had used D3 before for elections, and it was working great, but we would get memory leaks because it was just harder to know what you were doing. And normally on a graphic, it doesn't matter too much because you kind of like load the data, do a big load of rendering, and it's done. Maybe you have some little interactions, and perhaps they're leaking a tiny bit of memory, but it doesn't matter that much. Whereas with the election, it's like every 30 seconds or so, you've got new data coming in. And if that's causing the whole DOM to re-render, but at the same time, you're like accidentally sort of, leaking memory on every single node.
You're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, and it was things like that. So you would find it wasn't terrible, but you could find that maybe after half an hour or something like that, Chrome would crash.
Well, that's half an hour isn't even particularly long, right? To have something like that open.
Exactly.
Especially if you're like watching the election live and you're like waiting for the results. And
so I think I think we had it as bad as that in the end, but it was kind of like it was evident that we were having to spend more time thinking about how our D3 sort of use was, what we were doing and why we were leaking memory. Yeah. And in Svelte, you just don't really think about it. You're just like, as long as you sort of you do your mounts and unmounts correctly, It's great like that.
Yeah, on-mount and unmount going away.
Yeah. So,
How do you feel about that?
Oh, are they?
Aren't they?
Oh no, I think you're right. They are.
I think. Let's double check before we spread chaos in the podcasting world. Unmount. What's it called? Is it called Unmount?
No, it's destroy.
Destroy. You're right. I'm not finding anything here. Maybe it's not.
I think they're going to stay around.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be
in the long run,
lowercase or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah.
There's a bit of that's a sort of slightly strange thing where on click has become on click.
Well, I mean, it is strange, but not really.
Yeah. Once you
realize that it's the HTML way of doing it. So
yeah. But yeah, so that's it. So I use Svelte in a bunch of sort of side project creative things. I mean, I think as well, maybe it is also I'm a bit of a person who just sort of likes having a structure kind of already there for me.
Yeah.
Because I mean, ages ago I used to use Ruby on Rails, and again, I felt it was useful to have a kind of common structure, and then you're like, how are you deviating from this and why? Rather than sort of, you get projects where every person has just done their own sort of little cool thing, and you're trying to work
and that's
out.
very cool, but you don't understand anything, right?
Yeah.
Or it takes like 6 months before you understand anything.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, that's why SvelteKit is so nice.
Yeah.
For me at least, like every time I need a new page or anything, I just initiate a new SvelteKit project and I'm ready to go, right?
I keep meaning to make my own personal website. It's like there's sort of so many side projects which I never kind of get finished. I'm kind of I've been saying to a bunch of people, and I really need to just organise this myself in a sort of low-key way, about where we just have hackathons where you're not allowed to start anything. You just bring a project that you've been working on and you finish it.
Oh, that's a fun idea, actually.
We should.
I've thought about so back home. I've thought about because I want to get a couple of people together and just in the space where we work on stuff, but we don't necessarily work on the same thing. It's just like a hackathon style thing, but we just sit there and work. I guess that could be like a co-working space, but then...
Well, ages ago, when I lived in New York, this friend, Michael Keller, we have this group, and it still kind of runs sort of in a sort of sporadic way, which we named CSV Sound System. And it was just us meeting.
How does a CSV sound?
I don't know. That was one of the funny things, actually, is we had this name, and for ages, we're kind of like as if at some point we would actually start making music. And there has been a bit of that. Somebody made a thing where they kind of audiolized the sort of US Treasury report or something like that. There are projects out there because people have sort of said about this. There's quite a lot of projects where you can use Excel and various other things as if you're making like a sort of a beat tracking kind of thing. But I mean, that was the name of it. But it was quite nice in that we would just meet weekly, and it would just be kind of work on your side project. Because I think there can be that kind of thing where just in a space with other people, you can be sort of productive in a way.
And you go there and you know that this is sort of a social thing, but it's meant to be like a work and like maybe you have food or whatever, but
and because I suppose also you both get, it's interesting where you get direction. People are kind of like, wow, that's really cool. People are like, I don't, it's clear they're not quite understanding it. Yeah.
Why are you doing this?
Yeah. And things like that. I used to go to, I don't think I remember anymore, but the London Hackspace as well. And that was one of the things I remember the most is I was there and this guy came in and he had like this great big long rope of LEDs. And he, you're like, oh, what are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm making this like 1 pixel game. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. He kind of like talks through and I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds kind of interesting. Like he's a bit mad. And then like the next time I see it, I'm at the V&A.
The
Victoria and Albert Museum in London.
Okay, yeah.
They had this exhibit on games, and his game was there. I think his name is Robert Baumgartner, is it? If you look for like 1 pixel, it's really cool. It's like when you play it, it's actually I've seen a talk as well. He's talked about it, because it actually, it's got this sort of big spring that is kind of the controller. So you're basically you control one pixel on an LED rope.
Okay.
And you're just sort of moving along. And
kind of like Snake?
Yeah, and so there's kind of, you're sort of having to go over like a sort of a fire pit or things like that. There's a lot left to the imagination as to what these sort of obstacles are or might be. But it's one of those things where it's just like the sort of joy of the sort of interaction.
Yeah.
Is really cool. But yeah, it's that kind of serendipity and where you're sort of, and it's nice, you know, where that sort of thing where sort of, I'm like, this seems mad. And then you see it when it's finally done. You're like, wow, this is really cool.
Yeah. And he probably worked on that at like that hackerspace probably for quite a bit,
for ages. Right? Yeah, he's also built this amazingly beautiful thing with LED rings, a bit similar to that, where there's a kind of, again, loads of these springs. It's weird how, I think, because he just wanted a spring as a sort of a bit like a joystick, and went down this enormous kind of rabbit hole of like spring stuff. A lot of his talk was about that, because apparently there's some company in West London where you can just they'll make custom springs for you, which is what he ended up doing, because he was like, none of the springs I could find were quite right. And because I think, isn't it Hooke's law or something like this? I don't know if you studied this in physics, but, you know, there's a whole kind of like sort of early physics of like springs, and it's the whole kind of interesting thing about it. But
I'm sure it's way more complicated than at first glance, everything in the world.
Yeah, that's it. And, but yeah, just really, really beautiful interactions with LEDs and making just sort of these lovely sort of smooth kind of color transitions and things like that.
Yeah, like having a space to go to work on side projects and stuff. I think that's it's a productivity boost. It would be for me, at least.
It's a tricky thing, because I know the London Hackspace has been, there's been sort of, I think, kind of, you know, political issues and things like that with it and all of that, but there's also
political issues.
Well, you know, sort of like, it's one of those things where, like, as it grows, you know, you kind of like, you can be a victim of your own success.
I see what you mean.
So many people where they're kind of like, oh, it should be going in this direction or that direction, or you know, like, and you know, when it's sort of like, when everything works, where it's a nice community and everyone sort of like puts in at least the minimum, like more than the minimum effort that is required, you know, things work well. And then when people are sort of like, and so it's also been difficult, because I think that this is one of the big problems of where London has just got so expensive.
Right.
And so it's had to move around a bunch. And so areas where it's like, you can't be that
keeps
central.
Moving further and further away from the center.
And so and so it's like, it's the further it is, it's sort of like, if it's in, I think it's northwest London now.
Yeah.
And so it's harder, it's very tricky if you're in sort of southeast or something. But I mean, I think there are smaller ones that have sprung up. So perhaps that's, you know, the way, in a way, that is, you know, the success is that the smaller other ones appear.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you'd want it to be that big. Like, maybe 10 people is
I don't know if
that's enough.
Well, that was the thing, because I joined really early on, and I can't remember what they topped out at, but it was really scary the way they were sort of summing up to something like 20,000 members or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Wow.
And you're like, wow. Yeah.
How do you organize 20,000? Yeah.
But there's other fruits as well that come out of it. So there's also, I don't know if it's directly related, but there's also EMF Camp in the UK, which is electromagnetic field.
Yeah.
And that's a really fun festival, which is organised by Jonty, who was one of the Hackspace founders. So that's like nerds camping in a field. Actually, you were asking earlier. So
wait, I think you were talking, like last time we met, I think you talked a lot about this.
So yeah, that's really fun. That's this is the badge actually from that. So every year they've been sort of giving. I don't know where this began. I think it might have been, there's some other sort of hacker related conferences. I think it might be Black Hat or you know, something like this, where you were kind of getting. They started giving out chipsets as badges.
I'll take a photo of this as well.
So I don't know if it's got any power at the moment, but so there's a lot of really interesting sort of fun things like that. I think actually as well, just going back to Svelte, and there's lots of stuff with Svelte where I feel like I would like to contribute more, and I sort of, it's like it also looks like it's now quite complex. I mean, it's always been like this. I mean, I think that's Richard sort of said that it's one of the problems is that it's like you're having to think about code that generates code, which is just inherently quite complex.
Yep.
But I think as well, there's like the docs are always really fantastic, and I feel like there's things like that. Because I know as well, one of the things that I really liked early on was that we were using Svelte because we just Svelte for the front end. And so now we tend to use SvelteKit and everything is very harmonious. But I think there's still a lot of people that are using PHP and various other sort of like static sort of the front end generation bits of it, the sort of the static HTML. So sort of I think keeping them as part of that community is an important part. And
there's been some work on, like, not by the Svelte team but by others where they've tried to integrate other backends.
Right.
So I think one was like the hackathon last year. I think there was a Django thing.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it was, I think it was called DX Svelte. Is that right? And it's basically lets you use Svelte in your Django project somehow. Yeah.
I think that would be really good because I think a lot of people, it's quite easy to, well, it's strange. I mean, I go back and forth about the sort of the take up because it's like Svelte is now definitely at a point where it's got enough popularity and momentum that it's not kind of going anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like it's weird that it still seems always that the primary thing people seem to argue about is whether they like templates or not. And they're like, oh, I don't like handlebar type, templates.
Yeah, but I mean, that's. Do you think it would, like?
I don't know if
how would you get away from?
Yeah, I don't know if it would
template?
make much difference. Also, to some extent, I'm like Solid.js. If you don't like, if you want to do it, I'm like Solid.js has lots of great features, and Svelte has benefited, from a lot of the thinking that has gone on there too.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like we don't want just one framework to be the winner.
And that's kind of one of the downsides, I would say, of Svelte 5 is that it moves closer to the other frameworks, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's not the same, but you're introducing effect, which sounds a lot like the use effect thing in React. Maybe sure, it's not the same thing, but maybe you stop using React because you wanted to move away from that. To me, it feels a bit like. Even though I'm very excited about Svelte 5, it feels like it's losing a bit of its simplicity. I think we touched a bit on that earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, I worry about that rather than people arguing about handlebar stuff, templates. Like, that's more of a worry to me, that people that have never once coded anything in their life picking Svelte up and feeling, rather than, oh, this is just HTML and I don't have to worry about all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Suddenly feeling, what is an effect?
Yeah.
What is a derived? Like, what is this? So that's one of my worries, that we're going to lose that bit. There was at Svelte Summit as well, like a couple of years ago, there was a talk about I think a school in Norway that was using Svelte as like a learning, like to learn software development, because it was so simple to introduce to people, and you instantly get something on the screen.
Yeah,
it's so simple to get started with. But yeah, that's one my worry. Maybe it's unwarranted, but
no, I don't think. I think we do need to see how it goes. I mean, well, the thing is, it's the good news is that it's maintaining backwards compatibility.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it might be that it's like, to what extent does it'll be difficult if the take up of Svelte 5 is less than they were hoping. I mean, I'm not sure how the backward compatibility is maintained as well, as to whether it's sort of basically.
I think the plan is to deprecate Svelte, like the old syntax in Svelte 6, right? So it is going away, but not yet.
Yeah.
There's like it also depends a lot on what you're trying to build.
Yeah.
Because so like I mentioned, I only really use SvelteKit, right? I let the load functions and the form actions handle all of the reloading of data and like refreshing stuff. For me, Svelte 5 is mostly just like I have to write more characters, right?
Right.
But I mean, we're talking about 4 characters per state thing, so it's not like it's a lot, but and in some places you save some characters, and it's also like I guess it's more clear what state is. Oh, this is state, rather than just some random variable.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think because I was sort of saying how I was at that creative coding meetup yesterday, where we were looking at using P5.js, which again that's a great introductory tool. So it's a JavaScript fork of sort of processing.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Maybe re-implementation rather than a fork, actually. And I kind of go. I'm not. I think it's a great thing to learn. I feel, and I think actually, honestly, you could definitely do amazing big things with it. And I think it's just because I've kind of come from sort of other angles that I tend not to use that sort of paradigm. But they've done an amazing job as well of like bringing in sort of really good libraries straight into it. So you can just, which was sort of one of the demos yesterday, where you can just be like, I want a webcam and put hand tracking, and it's just
it just works.
Yeah. And that kind of thing.
That makes it very easy to get started and actually build something that's interesting, rather than like, this box changes color when I click.
So I'm thinking it might be, though, to some extent with that it's, so I think that still could be that the direction is that Svelte is, because you want to build the most kind of sort of valuable and best written sort of like thing there, and you could always be like, let's make a sort of subset and easier sort of idea of it, which is more if there is that kind of thing of like where people are wanting to kind of I think I agree with that. There's people who are wanting to build incredibly big complex web apps, sort of huge sites, because even with that, the graphics that we build are they're complex in their own way, but it's not. There's a sort of a different level because there's not that much sort of statefulness and things like that actually going on. And then there's people who are sort of more where you just want to code your own website but have sort of a lot of control. So I don't know. I think it'll be hopeful that we can sort of tune it to those different needs.
I hope so as well. I don't want the case to be that like I just don't want people to like pick it up. And then put it down because it looks too hard. And it is also the case that like Svelte 4 is this. It looks easier probably than it is. Like once you start using the reactive statements, then it gets a lot more complicated than you might think. It's funny actually,
because I know that the sort of I've seen those sort of long, which is I guess what sort of triggered the whole sort of change in a way, where there's a few issues around how, I think sometimes it's just a bit in terms of what's going on, where there's about 3 different ways of making something reactive. And they generate quite different code, even though sort of on the conceptual level, they look very similar. And then there's also where people kind of use that in a particular way, because it's kind of, and to what extent you could sort of say it's not exactly, there's kind of like, there is the API. So within that, it's a valid use of the API, but you might be like, well, I wouldn't do it that way, but whatever it is that people have done. And then because of that, they've ended up with sort of behavior that is not as they expect and it sort of is incorrect. And it's hard to know really with that. You could kind of be like, well, maybe if, you took that app and you would sort of rewrite it in a different way and that behavior could be eliminated through other sort of, design choices. But it feels like those problems are real, and so that is where I think that Svelte 5 has a sort of consistent sort of approach to things, which at least it doesn't mean that it eliminates those problems. It just means that they'll be consistent. Guess.
And
I think with
consistency is great. Like
it is, But I think with that as well, it's weird because I think we may now find as well though that the use effect, the effect sort of rune is where strange things will be put into there.
People would just use that for everything, even for things that should be derived. Probably is my suspicion. Like they're going to be like, why should I use derived when this thing?
Because I'll be like, this thing isn't doing it when I expect. I'll just stick it in here. Because essentially that is, I think, the algorithm that people, the sort of the internal sort of thing that I think.
For sure.
Something isn't working. I'll stick $1 in front of it. And actually, it's weird how much we found at work where things that needed $1 that we weren't expecting to. And that's much more with Svelte Kit, that it's quite easy to forget that you have this sort of bit of data that you've loaded, and you think, oh, this never changes, but it does, because you're sort of, when you're going from a page to a page,
when you go back and forth and
things like that.
Or if you're invalidating data in
Yeah.
a function, like then it reloads, and then maybe you accidentally destructured the data prop into
Yeah.
like, const. What could it be, like posts equals data,
Yeah.
and then you realize now it doesn't update because I
Yeah.
didn't put a $sign in front of the. Those kind of gotchas are going away though, right? Because in Svelte 5 the data is a rune, right? So you can it'll be fine grained. I think so, at least. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So you can do stuff like that.
Actually, one of the things I don't know, and I'm always keen to ask questions where like you shouldn't hold back just because it might make you look stupid. But does fine grain, like, because you have your template, is it able to? So I guess it's like it still is attempting to render the entire template.
Yeah.
But it is able to sort of be like, as it's going through it, it will say, well, this hasn't changed, so we can shortcut going over that. But it's not like it's kind of like if this variable sort of maps to this bit here and that bit maps to there, it's all still kind of one function. So it's still doing everything, but it's able to skip the bits it doesn't need to do. Is that the model?
That's a good question.
I should find this out.
I don't know. I know there's like one of the I think it's in the first blog post when Rich announced runes. There's a video as well, and in that video he shows like a list where using Svelte 4 you open. I think he opens the what's it called, the inspector. No, wait, he does something to show that like the whole list re-renders in the old version, and then in the new version it's just the bits that that I forget if he logs it or it's
does he? I think he flashes. He has a
that might be.
There's a use, I think, which is kind of like when this thing is it, you just play an animation to it. Yeah,
that could be it. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, exciting times.
Yeah. Actually, I find it's quite often as well. It's like if you think you might need or you could use another component, it's often good to do it.
Yeah.
The components, or just the way I work and sort of have seen it, that you get components that are too big, and it's very often as well things I found as well where it's much easier to solve it because the point at which the component is instantiated as well, it's then sort of encapsulated that whole thing, and sometimes like applying what is a damn store called where spring and all of those things, tweens and things like that it's much easier often to break that down into a much smaller thing where you're like, this is just the tweened version of this little tiny bit of DOM, rather than ups in the parent one trying to sort of like put the tween and put it in there
and then complicate all the logic. Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
Because you're just like, this is it, and also because when it's kind of like, this is it when it's created, and so that you usually don't want a tween on the initial value and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. So there's bits like that where I know as well that people complain about. Because I haven't really used React, I don't know about the joys of this idea that you have all these sort of templates within one file.
I used to work in React, and I hate that.
Like, you didn't like it, yeah.
I absolutely hate it because the files are so large, and I know, like, yes, you can search in the file, you can go between methods easily and stuff, but it's just like that mental overload of just seeing so many lines of text.
Yeah.
It's
I get really stressed once there's more than 300 lines. I don't know how some people do it, but
300 is a lot.
It is,
in my opinion. Yeah. So I try to keep them small. But it's subjective, right?
Yeah.
Like if you like it or not. I think it's preferable to just have one component per file because it's clear.
I suppose it's then the difficulty of like naming it and sort of how much of your structure. I know this person at the London Svelte meetup. I think, how many did he say? It was like up to 170 components or something like that.
Right.
And I was like, that does sound quite a lot to manage. But it sounded also that they were like using on almost every element. It was sort of like an H1 and H2 and title and everything like this was their own. And I'm like,
I don't know if I'd do that.
Well, I think if were they possibly using ND specs as well, because I think there's
that could be the case
where they were sort of trying to overwrite their own sort of logics onto it, but. Yeah.
Then it makes sense.
Yeah.
For sure.
But I think even with that, you just have to sort of structure them into folders carefully, and there's probably a bit more refactoring goes on with to keep them nice.
All right, so we've been chatting away for a bit. Is there anything that we've missed that you think we should talk to, or do you want to move on to the spicy bits?
Do the
all right
things.
So unpopular opinions. I told you before we started recording that you could bring up an unpopular opinion if you wanted to.
I don't know if it's unpopular. It might be quite popular even. I think it's often the way it goes. It's a rant. I think CSS just shouldn't exist.
Wow.
I think we've been doing it wrong.
Kind of wild opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think we've so it's also going way back in time. There was the CSS Zen Garden. And for me, that was the philosophical kind of direction we should have been going in, where you would write your HTML in a kind of way that made sense to the content that it kind of was wrapping. I mean, the huge caveat to all of this is that the web has become so much more like apps rather than documents. But yeah, still, I think with that, I still think that if we could talk to the people who make browsers, the actual developers who are absolute magicians, I don't know how it's all done. But we have all these kinds of really complex layers and sort of hierarchies and rules about, how style tags and the sort of important tag and all of this. And it's so complex and it's even just knowing what those specificity rules are is so manual.
I mean, it's a job in itself of knowing CSS properly, right?
And then there's I know they've added, I forgot what they're called. Is it layer now as well, where you can kind of do that as well? Yeah. And so
I think you can even type CSS variables now in Chrome.
And so that's it. It just feels like as a language, it's got so complex, and it's for designers. We want to be able to design things in a nice way, and I think it would actually benefit us if we were just writing. I think the browser could maybe help as well by having a sort of, or if we had a sort of more sort of standard. This is the way things are kind of looking. And you're just doing it, and then it's much easier to just apply style. And I think that would be much better as a browser tool. And I think it would also then it could just write it out as a binary format. I mean, I don't know. Because it doesn't really feel like this. The syntax is weird and complex and confusing.
It's very different compared to anything else. Yeah.
And
did you see the JavaScript framework that is made to look like CSS?
Oh dear.
It's called Corset. It's cascading binding sheets.
Okay.
Reactive UI without the complexity of SPA frameworks.
Okay.
Maybe something to check out if you like CSS.
But I think that's the kind of I think this could happen somehow. I think we'd need some browser genius to write a kind of be to just sort of at the level at which style sheets are actually being applied, to be look at a format that would make more sense to the browser,
right, and
just extract that out and then build from the browser a tool for making that. And then you would just add it on. Because, I mean, that is the thing, is we've always had it where it's type equals CSS or something like that. We could, if we could find this new format, we could just be let's add another link tag that is, type of, some better style sheet.
Style.
Yeah, and it was just if that exists, just throw away the CSS and use that.
Yeah.
And I think that would actually lead to us writing better HTML.
Yeah, because that's often an issue that people have. They're trying to write something that looks in a certain way rather than focus on the structure, because and the structure is important for people that.
And it's interesting that we have
use the structure.
There's been a bit of this with sort of Bootstrap and a few sort of other things, but that we don't have kind of globally shared kind of CSS as well. I mean, I also remember that very, very early days of Firefox. In fact, I think they've removed this now. I'm not sure, but you could, the way you could specify multiple style tags and as style sheets and give them, and say that they were alt and give them a sort of title. And then Firefox actually had somewhere in one of the menus where you could be let me just do this. So this was an early way of doing themes, so it was weird because that was so long ago.
Yeah.
And then it sort of has slowly come back where suddenly, at least, I mean, it's weird that I feel like that's why I say about the CSS Zen Garden, because it feels like so ideologically, it was kind of this is one piece of HTML, but we can make it look so different. And it's it's taken sort of decades now. It's been 20 years ago, I think, the CSS Zen Garden came out, maybe more.
Yeah, it's pretty.
And it's it was all the ideas have kind of slowly sort of come to fruition. It just feels like that a lot of companies have just been forever trying to be we just want to make it like a PDF. Their whole goal has been to control exactly how it looks for everything. And then it's been like, well, you have to make it sort of, for ages they held out on making sort of flexible designs. And they were like, we're just going to make it, 1024 wide or something like that.
Yep.
And they
we'll never have other screen sizes.
And then so mobile phones really, that absolutely wrecked that. And they're like, you've got to have mobile and desktop now. Yeah. And then, now there's sort of light themes and dark themes. And you're like, and I mean, it's also sort of all of the ideas with accessibility and things like that also come through. And it feels like it would just make, I mean, it's because it's not an easy thing. So I'm not saying like CSS is really complex. And it feels like with that, it's like people making beautiful style sheets that could be much more reusable across sites. It's like it's actually the sort of preciousness about design. I mean, I can understand because obviously you want things to look really good, but I feel like there's, and I mean, it would be interesting to talk to a designer about this because I think they would also have this kind of thing where they do, a lot of designers are like, they like actually having a sort of a shared kind of,
like a design system.
Yeah, a whole system like that, and that's it. And I don't think CSS really does that because it's kind of or you need tooling on top of it to make that happen. Or it's because it's like, and you see this a lot where the cascading, because it's the cascading that doesn't really work. It sort of flows down with complex rules that are not easily understood,
and then you just smack an important on there, and then
and so there's this kind of like the systematic way. So I think it would be like how to sort of like merge those three things together, where it's sort of like we're writing good HTML, you have a sort of design system that makes sense to designers, and then a sort of format that can actually efficiently sort of encode this, and an editor for controlling it.
Yeah.
So that'd be my big wish. That's a sort of controversial thing.
I do wonder how controversial that take is, though. Like, a lot of people do not like CSS, but,
I think
a lot of people do like CSS. So
I think if there's some amazing hacker out there who could build this, or maybe it already exists and I don't know about it, but it's kind of like perhaps it starts as a plugin or someone does it as an experimental thing.
I mean, I know there has been, like in some frameworks, there have been attempts at doing something like this. I think if you're familiar with Elm Lang, it's a JavaScript framework.
I've heard of it,
It's like a 100% fully functional style programming language for the front end. And I have some vague memory of them doing styling in a very particular way. Don't remember what though. So let's see if I can find some example here. This is great content for the people listening, just listening to me browsing the web over here. No, I can't find an example, but anyway, I know there's been some attempts of doing like another style of.
I mean, I guess that's the thing. Is I suppose a lot of the sort of systems and frameworks we have for CSS in a way are sort of trying to achieve something like this by sort of then writing their own sort of language, sort of which is then turned into CSS, and that probably to some extent I imagine that might be the best way to go, because I mean it's like maybe I don't know whether hacking into the way that the way it's represented within the browser would make sense. Also, I have no idea if browsers represent it in the same way between them.
Sure, right.
Possibly not. I don't know. It's
I have no idea.
Yeah.
All right, that's a hot take. So my unpopular opinion is that ORMs are not the way to go. The title here for my unpopular opinion is ORMs are shit. Just use SQL, but it's I don't know if I want to go that far, but. So ORMs are, I generally always find them to be, so for those that don't know, an ORM is, I think it stands for Object Relational Mapping.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. And it's basically an abstraction on top of either SQL or some other database. And it's supposed to help you interact with your database in a more convenient way, like handle writing doing common things like getting something like a row from the database or updating something or deleting something. But I always find them to be lacking in some way. So I always have to write raw SQL anyway. So,
how often though?
I mean, pretty often.
Really?
Like, and then also I often find myself doing, so for example, on the new Svelte Society website, so I'm using SQLite, and the search is powered by a SQLite extension called Full Text Search 5, which is relying on a virtual table. And in the the ORMs that I've been using, I can't do anything with the virtual tables because the concept doesn't exist.
Right.
So that's one limitation. Sure, I don't have to do that much work with the virtual table or anything, but still, just like having to, like so for example, I was using Drizzle, and then you define your table in like a JavaScript. You like const users equals Drizzle blah 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 blah. And you define the columns and stuff, but then there's no way to do it for virtual tables. So then I have to write SQL manually anyway, and then have to manually make it like go into the database, for example. And
so, I mean, back in Rails days, it had Data Mapper, and I was like, oh, I love this. Because I did used to write SQL. And it's also where there was, that was also, there was back then, SQL injection was a huge risk and problem. And I think it still is when it's easy to accidentally do it.
I think if you do it correctly.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, right? But I also think that the tools nowadays are a bit better.
Well, there was also, SQL injection was like the easy bug in some ways, but there was also a big problem where, say, for instance, where people would do things where it's like, find orders for this customer ID, but they weren't always checking that the customer ID that was being sent for that was the same as the logged in person, and things like that. So
get
there was
someone
also,
else's orders.
And so Rails, I think, made a lot of those sorts of things where there were sort of a lot of examples on that, but also sort of making it easier to be like sort of adding on kind of relational kind of mappings like that.
Yeah. So to be clear,
I think text search is a bit of a strange one. I mean,
it is niche. Yeah.
Bit of me is kind of like, well, you could just use Solar or something like that anyway.
It's one example. Another one would be like triggers in SQLite, for example.
Right.
Can't write that in an ORM.
I don't know if you can. Well, also I use Prisma, and it's very.
Like I love the way that you define tables in Prisma. Like I really like it. It's much cleaner than the SQL way of doing it. But yeah, it's and then there's like you're relying on them implementing everything correctly and like mashing together the transactions correctly, and then you end up in some weird bug. So I recently stress tested the Svelte Society website, the upcoming one, and I added, I think, 2 million rows into the database just to like see, like, can I actually fetch stuff without like lagging the website? And it was very easy to do that. And with SQL, I had more control. I could do like explain query plan, so I could see like, oh, how does the SQLite engine actually think about this, and what's it going to do? Oh, I need an index here, so I'll add an index, and then fixed like the performance issue I was having, stuff like that. Hard to do with an ORM. I mean, you can obviously combine, but you don't really know what the ORM is doing, right, under the hood.
I don't know. I'm pretty happy with Prisma. I mean, I feel like I do. You can ask it to print out what it's actually doing. Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
So, I mean, I think also because of the typing as well, it's nice.
The typing is a big one. Yeah, for sure.
But there have been some strange things. I mean, I know because Prisma has its own kind of model around. It's been a little while since I've used it as well, but it was kind of like it has its own model around how transactions happen. So I think there might be some things where I've kind of been like, well, based on, this is an internal app and we've only got a few thousand people tops using it, the chance of like in that tiny millisecond between, you've kind of committed this thing and then you go and fetch it back or something like that, that it's changed. Yeah. Whereas, as a purist, I would be like, there's probably a way to write this in a single transaction. Or something. I don't know even that. Did I mention it? I can't remember, but certainly there's the transaction model is slightly different because it has to sort of map across different databases. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, that complicates things quite a bit, I guess.
Well, I feel like I might have to look at it again as to whether there is actually, I can't remember whether it was an actual problem or it was just that it was kind of different from how I would have done it if I didn't have Prisma.
Right.
But I'm not aware of any problems occurring as a result of it ever. But I see what you mean. I mean, I think it depends how much kind of CRUD-like stuff you're doing. Because, I mean, some people, you have those kinds of things where you're just like, you've got loads and loads and loads of tables, and you're like, all the thing is just about shunting it back and forth.
Right.
And that kind of thing. And so just for the sort of like typing alone, and then also migrations are really, I think they're quite nice generally. So,
I don't think they're too hard writing yourself.
I'm not saying, I think you can definitely be too small for an ORM to be worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, or I think, well, back with Rails as well, because it was built in, and so you were just kind of like data mapper was just there and you just used it.
Yeah.
And there was, I think Rails had a really good sweet spot for, I mean, actually it's interesting because Svelte hasn't really kind of gone in or taken any particular opinion, I don't think, on this yet. Or maybe it won't do. I think probably won't.
I think it will.
Oh, you think it will? Oh, okay. Well, that would be interesting. But because there was that sort of thing with Rails where your sort of initial scaffold would be kind of like it would make a little table that was sort of editable and sort of mapped to a database table.
Yep.
And that does cover an awful lot of kind of apps where it is just kind of, taking things in and out of a table and sort of validating them at some point and things like that. So yeah, I think there is still, Rails is still going very strong as well. I mean, I think that's actually, there's a sort of an alignment there actually, in that Rails never became a dominant kind of player, but it was it's very influential. And
then you have like Laravel, which is pretty big, I think. Yeah. Well, to be honest, Rails probably is quite big.
It's hard to know. I
think it's bigger than we think it is.
Like it's very hard sometimes to estimate how much these things are. Because I know as well, I go to, I don't so much now, but I used to go to an awful lot of hackathons. And it was always like, it was through the Rails community. So I was always going along and there's all these sort of like other people doing Rails and stuff like that. And we'd meet people who were doing Python and Django as well. And, sort of like go back and forth a bit about that. And, but it always felt like it was probably the same people. And then sometime I went to this hackathon at Microsoft. And it was all these people who were doing .NET.
Yeah.
And it just, they were so different and we like knew nothing. We were just like in totally different sort of like what you were thinking about and their approach to stuff. It was weird. It made me realize how, the differences between what we were talking about with the Python people was so minor, relatively, as to how we were sort of approaching things.
Yeah.
But,
no, I mean, maybe I should give ORMs another chance. I do not like them though, but
yeah. So you've been using Prisma?
Yeah, for a bit. Prisma and then Drizzle.
Right. I haven't tried Drizzle. So.
It's similar.
But maybe I don't know. Maybe I need to be doing weirder things with them so that I start to hate them too.
When you realize what you can do with SQL. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could do field validation in SQL, right? And race exceptions.
You can also do some really weird things in SQL.
I mean, that is very weird to do field validation and race an exception.
But even just some of the databases support it natively, but like trees in SQL are really weird, where, you're kind of like being like, well, I want to sort of select all of the subtrees of this, and people can do these really bizarre queries that will kind of do it and sort of flatten it all out and bring it back. But you're like, it's just
unreadable.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I know for a while Oracle was one of the few that did support this sort of idea of trees, but I bet Postgres does it now.
Probably.
And
I feel like Postgres supports everything now.
Yeah, that's it.
I never really. So the thing about using SQLite is that you kind of escape the N+1 problem, where in a client server paradigm, you have to go back and forth over the network. Even if the server is local on the same server, you're still going through the network because that's how it works. But with SQLite, you just have a file and you can just like write.
Because you're just going through.
You can just write very small, readable queries and just like do it sequentially, and you'll see like, oh, I'm getting the content, I'm getting the tags for the content, and I'm putting them together, or whatever it might be, right? So maybe that's a reason why I don't feel like I need ORMs, because the queries that I write are very, very simple.
I think as long as you're not having security problems, then it's probably okay.
Yeah.
And you could. I know there's definitely tools, sort of lighter weight tools, which will kind of ensure that things are escaped and things like that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think most clients do that now if you use it correctly.
Yeah. Because I think that was the scary thing where people were just concatenating strings in kind of mad ways.
Yeah.
I've definitely made some bugs like that in the past, and definitely found some and things like that.
We'll see when the new Svelte Society website goes live. We'll see how long it takes before we're hacked.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, all right. Picks. Do you have one?
Wait, I forgot now. I was trying to think of something. Do you have one?
I was going to say SQLite, but I've been talking about SQLite for so long now, so I'm just going to say London. It's a very nice city. I like coming here. It's great.
Well, this is a technology one, which is interesting. So it was at the London Svelte chat, and I've forgotten his name, but I've only just... It is a public repo, but there's this library called Gooey, Gooey.
Oh, you're talking about Brady?
Yes, that's it, Brady's, and I really like it. So it's a kind of sort of thing for fiddling around with the properties of things. So I've been using Svelte Tweak Pane previous to this. Well, actually, I say I'm still using Svelte Tweak Pane because I've only looked at Gooey and been like, this is interesting.
Sorry, what's Svelte?
Tweak Pane.
Tweak Pane, all right.
So I would highly recommend Svelte Tweak Pane. There's no but he had been using that, and it was essentially, he has some very, very fancy kind of audio and sort of visual kind of the tools that he's built, and so for that he needs a lot of kind of custom and sort of complex kind of abilities to tweak it. So I mean, also I'd say to any listeners that it's a bit like if you've used DAC Gooey, which was a popular thing that the Google's data arts team made. But it's one of these sorts of things.
Digital audio converter.
No? I think DAC. I don't know what it stood for. I think it might have just been
is it
like
DAC?
DAT.
DAT.
Yeah, I don't know whether they were like that. I don't know whether, or maybe it did start for digital arts team. Maybe it's probably digital arts team.
I misheard. I thought you said DAC, like a digital audio converter thing.
But I don't know. I think they also copied it from somewhere else. But it's one of these things, where you see in a lot of languages and programming things where. Sort of the ability to tweak the values of things. And yes, Svelte Tweak Pane, I love, use it a lot, but I will be investigating Gooey because it looked, and particularly as well because I have reached, which Brady was saying that I've reached that point where there's sort of sometimes I'm like, I want to make my own interfaces to things. Like there was a thing where I wanted to have a sort of weird sort of change in your relative position in time, and things like that. Yeah, because all the problems with times and time zones. And so it's...
I am very well aware of time zone issues.
Yeah. Actually, that was an interesting thing, which I probably don't know enough about yet, but there was that proposal, or maybe it's even more, is perhaps at a further stage than that, but the sort of new JavaScript sort of time and time zone.
Yeah, it's called Moment? No, that's the library.
That was the one of the libraries, yeah. Sorry, that is called...
it's called...
Temporal.
Temporal.
Yeah, because actually, interestingly, other colleagues at Bloomberg worked on it. I don't know which ones they were, but they were. Yeah, they're some of the initial proposals. But yeah, it does. It's definitely something that's been quite bad in JavaScript. So I look 100%. Forward to better things. But I mean, a lot of it as well is just you realise how fundamentally complex time and time zones are.
Yes. Yeah, and the fact that there are like time zones where the difference is like 15 minutes or 30 minutes instead of an hour, which is what
actually this would pop into the controversial things, which I'd need to understand somebody to talk with someone who understands it better. But there's also this problem with leap seconds. We did a graphic on this ages ago, and so because we've been adding leap seconds a bit, so I can't remember how we like 15 seconds ahead now or something of that of UTC. But I'm like. One of the things I wondered is, why can't we just let the leap seconds be applied to time zones or something like that? It feels like, because time zones are already weird, so it feels like it would be better.
Just put the weird stuff in the time zones.
Yeah, and then to just be like UTC would just, I mean, the thing I realise now is they're saying they can't really get rid of the 15 seconds either, so there's this like gap between UTC and the POSIX timestamp.
Isn't there something about leap? There's something about like how if we would have made the year 13 months and 28 days or something, then it would just have been like perfect. something like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, at some point it's going to have problems, isn't it? Because the Earth is slowing down. But
well, sure.
because as I understand as well, like half of it, they were like, this was to theoretically please astronomers, and astronomers are like, oh, we don't use any of that anyway because it's completely useless.
Right. It doesn't,
we just
doesn't
use
matter.
like, they do something a bit like POSIX numbers anyway, just with their own atomic clocks.
Like SI unit, but
Yeah.
for time or whatever. Yeah.
But it's interesting with alternative calendars. I mean, it's interesting actually. A lot of those, there's support for other calendars already. I think in JavaScript.
I mean, there are other calendars, right? You have the is it Arabic or Islamic calendar or something like that? I don't remember what it's called.
Based. But yeah, and we're not really. I don't know how many people sort of organise day to day on those, because as I understand as well, this is sort of a weird sort of Wikipedia dive from ages ago, but the Kodak Eastman company apparently internally used their own calendar system until like the late 60s or something like that, and you're just like, wow, that must have been so strange.
That's wild.
That you would go to work and there would be 13 months at work and there's only sort of 12.
Does that mean then that maybe there were a lot of different calendars that people were using that weren't like standard?
Yeah, quite
just
possibly.
Like, oh, at this company we use this weird calendar because...
It feels strange that we haven't... It feels weird that if Kodak were kind of trying to advance things, they were sort of like saying, we think that this calendar is going to be better for our business needs or something like that. I mean, I suppose with that we found that it's very hard, that an improvement has to be really significant to be worth the kind of costs of the adaptation. And I think also the trouble with it is it's like unfamiliarity with it. And I mean, because I'm with that, I mean, I'm like the kind of chaotic person who could be like, let's change everything. I'd quite like us to change to a dozenal number-based system instead of decimal. But I think that one's really fun now.
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen. All right, and on that note, I guess we're done. Unless you have something else.
No, I think that's the perfect point to end it.
All right. It was great having you on as a guest. Well, actually, I'm at your place, so thank you for having me.
Both mutual guests, yeah.
And to all the listeners, you will find all the links in the show notes, and I will see you again next time. Probably not next week, but next time. Bye-bye. Hey, it's Kavir. If you like the show, please drop a review on your favorite podcast player. It would help out a lot. Thanks.